Yeah, I've been involved in OSM since the beginning. So it's my pleasure to give kind of an operator and a UAG perspective. That's end user advisory group or operator group. Um, so I've been just like I'm the vice chair of the Network Operator Council, the NOC group in ZSM, and I've been involved in NOC groups in ETSI, NFV, et cetera. It's another operators group. And so, like all of them, the UAG in OSM provides a vision and a direction, the overall direction for OSM. So it's similar that way. But I think one of the things that differentiates OSM UAG is that the UAG is actually um, firmly in line with how the release requirements are done. And this is open source, this is not standard. So we talk about a release, we're talking about 6 months time frame. So I guess in my opinion, OSM UAG has been one of the most responsive feedback to operators. So that's been real, it's been real nice to work in there. So if you're operators out there, I would really encourage you to participate in the UAG because you will get a lot of attraction and feedback. So yeah, so there's releases every 6 months, and all the requirements are very practical focused, right? So we're not doing standards kind of consensus building and compromises and all that. We really try to look at what we really need to deploy things with. I think in terms of automation, Mano is really the heart of it. Orchestration, it's one of the toughest problems that we operators have to solve, right? As we go on this in this journey. So it's really good to have a open source project that deals with that. And it's really good that it's an open source platform, right? Because orchestration, you have to deal with many different vendors, VNFs, and work them together. So although you could maybe buy a vendor's product that works very well with other vendors' VNFs, I suppose that can be built, but from an operator point of view, we don't want to be locked in like that. We would like to build our own platform and then leverage the VNF assets from our different suppliers. So it's really good to have an open source project just for Mano. So OSM is not really kind of experimental POC kind of a thing, right? We look at it as building something for reality. So industrial strength implementations that are production ready, and we learn by doing. That's a common theme that you'll hear in OSM today. And so it's only focused on the Mano aspects, right? So it's not doing everything. It's not everything to all people. So sometimes, it's up to interpretation. What does Mano do? So we try to draw some boundaries there in what happens there. Okay, so in terms of automation, really Mano is it's been in the thought process from the beginning, right? Because there's all these different automation workflows, like I mentioned earlier this morning, right? You have the design and development or onboarding into the service catalog. Then you have your instances that you're lifecycle managing. And then once everything is up and running, you have a kind of maintenance and scaling and healing that's going on. So I think, at least in my opinion, I think OSM is, it's done some in all of these areas, but it's more on the second and third. So yeah, the design process and onboarding, OSM operates more at the VNF and a V level, so you don't have that service level kind of thing that I think is a problem that we need to solve. But in terms of lifecycle management of the instances, OSM has tried to build some good tools where you can manage the lifecycle without impacting and making everything else fall apart. And then a lot of emphasis has been placed in the once things are running, how do you do the scaling and healing and monitoring and some of the features that you heard about previously. And then also, it's across the different layers, right? So we have things like network service. These are terms from ETSI and NFV. So, you have VNFs that are connected together in a network service. Below that, you have virtual resources. Like VMs, virtual links, virtual connections, et cetera. And then above that, you have even some support for network services nested within a network service. So it's kind of a nice across the layers thing there. And one of the goals has always been to be policy driven, because we all have different policies in our networks. And I think that's a feature that's that's coming up now. And another important thing is that from the very beginning, it's been like multi-Vim and multi-SDN. So there were requirements from the different partners to use different VIMs from the very beginning. So that's been baked into the architecture and the solution from the get-go. So you don't have to use OpenStack, for example, and that's what it means. So, and then I think as the panel was talking about before, right, choices are good. There are all these new technologies, so you need a very pluggable architecture. You need something where you can kind of swap out one technology with the next newer thing that comes along without disrupting as minimally as possible. So, I think earlier today it was mentioned like when this NFV journey started, it was all virtual machines, and then Docker, and now Kubernetes is here, and it's really big, and we need to make that journey now, but it's not going to be just everything in containers, right? So it's going to be a combination, et cetera. So we need some way to do this with the right abstractions, I think, like we said before. Okay, I think you'll see this picture often, maybe this morning, learn by doing. So, you have the typical standards development via waterfall, and I guess this abstract Escher picture is more iterative model for open source. And so OSM definitely has learned by doing on the right side here. And once again, I'll emphasize that UAG is really part of this feedback loop. And I think, in a standards organization, it's really good for an operator group to set requirements and set the direction. But I think for open source, it's really critical because these cycles are so short that you need to be able to see, bring it into our lab, see what happens, and then be able to feedback some stuff and fix it right away in the next 6 months. So it's been a kind of a nice system here. Okay, this is a complicated picture of ETSI NFV specifications, I guess, to impress. Lots of different specs. You see some in blue, some in green. I think the green ones are stage 3. There are more details. Those are more recent documents that NFV has produced with the detailed bits and bytes. So there's a lot of stuff going on. I guess here the mention is that OSM is leveraging ETSI NFV, but I guess I'd want to add that OSM is not like the software development for ETSI NFV. We leverage it, but then we learn from it, we build on top of it, and we try to make the best Mano solution. And of course, NFV is more than just Mano. So I'm not going to talk any details here. I think the talks after me will provide lots of nice detail. But here's a picture of some of the interfaces that OSM is supporting. So not everything. We've made some decisions on if there are different choices, which way to go. Try to build that on practicality. And so I think the more detailed presentation will talk about it. But it gives you just an indication. There's a lot of stuff happening, and some of these interfaces are Mano related, some other things, and maybe more OSS or something else that Mano doesn't try to boil the ocean and do everything. Okay. All right, so here's some of the features in Release 3. And what I want to point out today is that I think most of these, or maybe all of these, I remember started back at discussions in the UAG, right? So, for example, when we tried out in the lab the first couple of releases, usability, some of the interface stuff was a little, creaky, didn't always work, it was inconsistent. So really we tried to bring that feedback back, and then that was improved in the next release and further improved. Things like onboarding VNFs, sometimes whether it would fail or not, the interface kind of went out of sync, and then you weren't sure if it was really running, or then if you terminated something, was it really terminated? You weren't sure. So these were all improvements that were initially discussed in the UAG as well as in the whole group. But the community has been very supportive to do that. Same with role-based, right? We said that was something that was missing. Multi-Vim support's been there from the beginning. EPA is another thing that, OSM has been kind of struggling with because, for example, OpenStack is not great with EPA attributes. And so we've been trying to work on how do we do that. So I guess my point is that a lot of these things are kind of end-user driven, which is really great. So it's not like, a vendor out there says, I have a shiny new feature that I want to wedge into the open source here. It's not like that. It's really from a practicality point of view. And you saw some of the other things that Francisco Javier talked about, like the efficiency, right? We also saw in the beginning the install time was very long and it was very crude, and that's really been improved, so it's a much streamlined install, and we hope that will promote not only better, efficient running of the thing, but also promote other developers and other ecosystem to adopt it widely. So I think these are all kind of important aspects. Yeah, so those are the main things. So I'll just kind of close out here by saying that, a lot of the OSM activities are very end-user focused. So, for example, and maybe this will be talked about later, there's been some architectural changes that we took from ETSI NFV. So in terms of, we're going to use a generic VNFM because that's what most end users want, and that makes, I think, the best overall solution. And we restructured some of the architectural components. I won't go into the details, but basically the orchestrator and the VNF manager was kind of shuffled around into these three categories where service orchestration and resource orchestration is actually separate because we felt that makes the most sense technically, right? And so we weren't afraid to do these improvements over this. But one of the things that other operators, and I think people said that, hey, we don't want this divergence, right? And that's kind of what's happening today. There's really a lot of fragmentation. All this open source groups are out there. I think personally, open source is really good at creating a solution. But I think this question was asked before. I don't think open source is really great at promoting interoperability across different domains and across everything. I don't know if it's a standards group, but something else needs to do that. But open source is really good at a concrete solution. So there was a lot of requests from the OSM community to feed these learnings and information back into ETSI NFV so they could update their spec. And that's been an ongoing process of feedback loop. So we try to keep everything aligned and not try to fragment the market, the industry more. So I think these are kind of the highlights from an operator point of view. And I think next you'll hear about kind of more of the technical details. So that's it. Thank you.